we now get to talk about the fun stuff when it comes to the endocrine system. And the very first gland that we're going to talk about that plays a crucial role in controlling the endocrine system is the hypothalamus. You'll remember from when we discussed the nervous system that the hypothalamus is this tiny little area that packs an incredible punch and controls so much. It's going to help control the enteric nervous system around the GI tract. It's going to play a role in regulating sleep-wake cycles and water and electrolyte balance and emotions and sexual response and so much more. It is found within the diencephalon. It's one of the structures in the diencephalon, and it has neuroendocrine-like functions. It is the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and those two body systems are very, very closely linked. It is also going to be a very important part of the limbic system because it is going to be the so-called emotional control center of the brain. So it's going to integrate the activities of both the endocrine and nervous system. How does it do that? It's going to exert either direct or indirect control over multiple organs or structures within the endocrine system, and also over other organs which have endocrine-like functions. How does it do that? It's going to secrete its own regulatory hormones. So it's going to produce and secrete either releasing hormones or inhibitory hormones. It contains autonomic nervous centers. So when you hear autonomic, think automatic. So it's going to help control and regulate many of the autonomic functions of your body. And it will all by itself synthesize and release two hormones that are not regulatory hormones, or specifically regulatory hormones. Let's take a look. So here's our hypothalamus, and it is going to secrete regulatory hormones, which will actually control what the anterior lobe of the pituitary does. It might secrete hormones that say produce more of this hormone, or it might secrete hormones which says produce less of this hormone or stop producing it. It will have control of sympathetic output via neural connections to the adrenal medulla, which is going to be responsible for producing and secreting epinephrine and norepinephrine. And as we said, it's going to produce and secrete two other hormones, which don't have regulatory functions when it comes to the anterior pituitary, and those will be antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. We already talked about this. It secretes regulatory hormones. This is a repeat, so that's how important this is. It's going to control the endocrine cells of the anterior pituitary through those regulatory hormones. And the hormones of what's known as the adenohypophysis, fancy term and another name for the anterior pituitary. Those hormones produced or secreted by the anterior pituitary will control the activities of other endocrine glands or other endocrine areas in the thyroid, the adrenal cortex, and the reproductive organs, and other things too, other structures too. So let's go into a little bit more detail about the regulatory hormones it produces and secretes. As I said, it's going to produce and then secrete either releasing or inhibitory hormones. So here's a classic example. Releasing hormones will stimulate the synthesis and secretion of one or more hormones from the anterior pituitary specifically. Inhibiting hormones will prevent the synthesis and secretion of one or more hormones from the anterior pituitary. And a specific endocrine cell may be controlled by either or both of those types of hormones. Here's an example, thyroid releasing hormone. So the hypothalamus will produce and secrete what's known as thyroid releasing hormone when you are really cold or under a lot of stress. That hormone will target the pituitary, specifically the anterior pituitary, and tell it you need to secrete more TSH, which is thyroid stimulating hormone. That hormone, TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone, stimulates the thyroid. Isn't it great when the name tells you exactly what it's doing? It's going to stimulate the thyroid, which will produce these hormones that are crucial to metabolism, which are going to be T3 and T4. And this shows you the relationship between the hypothalamus and the pituitary is the next gland we're going to discuss. So here's the hypothalamus, and here's the pituitary. And you'll remember from when we talked about the skeletal system that the pituitary is going to sit within that bony landmark of the sphenoid bone, which is known as the sella turcica. And you'll notice that there's going to be this collection of blood vessels right around from the hypothalamus down around the anterior pituitary. So these neurosecretory cells of the hypothalamus, some of them are going to produce and release hormones that will target the pituitary gland and the part of the circulatory system that they're going to need to get those hormones from the hypothalamus to the pituitary are right there, up close and personal. We know also that the hypothalamus contains autonomic centers, which will provide direct control over endocrine cells that are located within the adrenal medulla. When you have an activated sympathetic nervous system, the adrenal medulla is stimulated directly and immediately. This will trigger the adrenal medulla to secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine into the circulatory system. And this shows you the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal, or HPA, axis. So the hypothalamus will also have a relationship in terms of the production of what's known as ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. Let me repeat that, adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will target the adrenal cortex. Adrenal gland has two parts, the medulla and the cortex. So when you talk about the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, you're talking about a pretty complex system of what are known as neurohormones between three glands, and the glands are in the name: hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the adrenal glands. Why do we care? Because the physiology of all those things listed there, immunity, fertility, stress, are regulated by this HPA axis. It's going to include both positive and negative feedback systems. And as I mentioned before, the hypothalamus will secrete hormones that stimulates the anterior pituitary to produce adrenocorticotropic hormone, which will target the adrenal cortex. Two most important hormones that are going to be involved are corticotropin releasing hormone, secreted by the hypothalamus, and vasopressin, also known as ADH. Those two are going to work together to increase the production of ACTH. Why do we care? because these will be released in response to stress. They will stimulate the anterior pituitary to produce ACTH, which in turn will trigger the release of cortisol, which is associated with stress. And we're going to be talking more about this when we get to the adrenal glands. So hold that thought. In addition, the hypothalamus synthesizes two hormones and moves them along these neurosecretory cells within the infundibulum. It's the infundibulum that attaches the pituitary to the hypothalamus. And the two hormones are oxytocin, the love hormone, and antidiuretic hormone ADH, also known as vasopressin. Those will be stored in the posterior pituitary. They are not produced by the posterior pituitary. The posterior pituitary just acts as a storage tank for those, and they will be released when required.